So we'll kick start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this workshop on behaviour, wellbeing and the environment. My name is Kate Laffan, and I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at University College Dublin in the Geary Institute for Public Policy. And together with my co-host, Dr. Leonard Lades, who's also at the Geary Institute, Dr. Ganga Sridhar, Dr. Christian Krekel, and Daniele Policino of the Psychological and Behavioural Science Department at LSE, we'd like to thank you for coming and joining us for this workshop and this two-day event. The idea for the workshop was really born out of a shared interest amongst all of us in the reciprocal relationship between what we do and how we feel and how that links to the natural world. We all work on behavioural science and wellbeing research on topics like how environmental quality relates to subjective well-being, how behavioural interventions can be used to shape our shared impact on the environment, how our emotions influence how we think about the environment and how we feel. We're also all passionate environmentalists, and against the backdrop of COP, we were wondering how bringing these areas of research together could help us further our understanding of the intersection of behaviour, wellbeing and the environment. And if I can say it as loftily as this, to potentially propose solutions or new ideas that can help us address some of the pressing environmental challenges the world is currently facing. So as I said, lofty goals for a two-day workshop, but that's why we need at least 2 days of your time. And we're going to spend those 2 days hearing from leading researchers in these different areas and try to create a dialogue around the intersection of behaviour, wellbeing and the environment. The first day will focus more so on well-being, the second day on behaviour, but both well-being and behaviour will branch across both days. We'll start shortly with an opening talk from Professor Andrew Oswald and then an afternoon of research presentations. Then tomorrow we'll have a panel discussion followed by more research presentations, and we'll end with an opportunity for networking where hopefully everybody who's still hanging in at that stage will come together, have some discussion and think about what kind of forward steps we can take moving on from the workshop. There are a few thank yous that we have to make. Sorry, just to say that the schedule will be available in the chat and in the Eventbrite. So if you want the detailed breakdown, I'll direct your attention there. We have a couple of thank yous to make before we get started. The first is to our fantastic group of speakers. We were really blown away by the people who agreed to come and talk to us. All of them, as I said, are leading researchers on these topics, but they've also acted as sources of inspiration for us over the years for our own work. So we're extremely excited to hear from them, and we hope you are too. We'd also like to thank the National University of Ireland for funding this workshop through their early career grant scheme. I believe the scheme is reopening again soon this academic year, and I'd encourage anybody who's eligible to apply to consider looking at it. It's a really great source of funding for hosting this kind of event, so well worth a look. A few housekeeping things just to mention before we get started. We are going to record these sessions and make them available after the fact. So that's fantastic. It means you'll be able to step out if you need to at some point and come back and look at what you've missed. But it also means that if you do want to stay anonymous, we'd ask you to keep your cameras off and direct any questions that you have through the chat function. We're going to use both the chat function and also the mic function over the course of the workshop to direct questions. And we really want it to be as participatory as it possibly can be, given the size of it. So do get involved, pose your questions, but when you're not talking, we'd ask you to keep yourself on mute so that we can manage to hear ourselves and each other. The last thing I'd like to say, so with all of that out of the way, I'm just going to move to our first speaker and introduce Professor Andrew Oswald. Andrew is a professor of economics and behavioural science at the University of Warwick. He's a senior research fellow at the Wellbeing Research Centre for Oxford University and the ISA Institute in Bonn. He's also a research fellow there with a special responsibility for work on climate change. He's one of the pioneers of happiness economics or subjective well-being research, and his recent work is around topics around citizens' attitudes towards climate change issues, the determinants of human happiness and psychological well-being, the consequences of air pollution, the behavioural influence of the human diet. So endless amounts of interesting and important topics that are real relevance to what we're trying to do over the course of the 2 days. He's extraordinarily highly cited and has published articles across a range of different disciplines. He's also on the editorial board for Science. So I can really think of no better person to open up this workshop and to share his own expertise on behaviour, well-being and the environment. We're very honoured that you agreed to talk to us today, Andrew, and really looking forward to your talk. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It seems more like an honour to me, to be honest, and that's partly because UCD and LSE have actually both played quite distinguished roles in the last 20 or perhaps 30 years in this broad area. If I look at the title, which is still on my screen, Behaviour, Wellbeing and the Environment, it does seem to cover pretty well all the important stuff in social and behavioural science. And I know that Dublin researchers and LSE researchers have written some very, very important papers, written in different ways, on environmental economics, how to estimate well-being equations, and all sorts of things like that. I'm going to view this as a kind of opening to encourage discussion. So I'm not going to talk for 30 minutes, even though I appear to have been allocated 30 minutes, but perhaps I'll talk for 10 or 12, maybe 15, and then get your reactions, and we might have a general dialogue. Now, although of course I've got some background in estimating what we might call happiness equations, I'm not going to talk about that a lot in these 10 or 12 minutes. I certainly look forward to listening to Murako speak, I think, after me, and I greatly admire his work. But I thought I'd consider things more generally, ladies and gentlemen, if I may. Partly this is because of COP26. There's a sense in which I'd like us to ponder how we can really help the world in a practical way now, as we understand the difficulties of climate change and environmental issues. And I think that probably many of you agree with this, but my view is that the kinds of well-being equations, happiness equations, mental health equations that a lot of you and I are familiar with can actually put values on, financial values, if you like, values compared to other things, on very important aspects of life that shape human feelings that don't come with automatic price tags, like how important to us is clean air, how are we going to be affected by temperature, and so on. Our group potentially has an especially important role to play, and will play over the next 50 years. Now, some of you will know the name Glenn Youngkin. 48 hours ago, he was elected governor in the state of Virginia in the USA. And over the last few days, Mr. Youngkin was interviewed on television, and he was asked about climate change and the environment. He said that he didn't know why global temperatures were rising. He didn't know the cause, and he didn't think that the cause was important. He feels, he's now elected, of course, that the key reaction that we should have is to build higher sea walls and similar kinds of abatement behavior. He's also against the Clean Air Act. That's not the exact words, but they go out of my head, for Virginia, which the state of Virginia passed, which promised net zero by 2050. He's against that on the grounds that it will put up utility bills for his voters. I'd like us to think about that generalized to our country, among others. Let me try and share a screen. I'm wondering, Kate and others, whether you can see a picture of the sun here, can you?
We can, yeah, thank you.
You can. So I'd like you to read the headline. We fear that this comes from about 10 days before COP26. We fear that the Prime Minister's net zero plans will become a millstone around the economy's neck. Let's see if we can go on. Here's the Daily Mail. Probably a lot of readers, a lot of watchers understand that the sun is very highly read. It's not my usual reading, but it seems very important for people like us to appreciate what the fairly normal person, the normal voter in particular, believes. Here's the Daily Mail. How I pine for a Tory government that's not going to preside over an uncosted madcap eco-revolution. The Mail is possibly the biggest selling newspaper in the UK, and certainly one of the most influential. And here finally, it's from the Daily Telegraph, which is also a very important newspaper, widely read. We need a referendum on net zero to save Britain from the green blob. Now, you may not be familiar, ladies and gentlemen, with the technical term green blob, but it boils down to the political elite is imposing, as if you see the second line, a revolution on the public without consent. That is the strong implication in this. This is one of the lead writers for the Daily Telegraph, is that citizens in my country are being forced to think about net zero and perhaps more generally think about reducing their emissions. Let's see if I can stop that screen. Now, how are we going to think about this? I think if we're behavioral scientists and economists, and we have seen for ourselves in our equations or just from other sources the importance of environmental aspects in our lives, in principle, you and I have a key role to play here. I'm afraid I do not have all the answers on how we are going to do this, or all the answers on how we're going to design policy. But perhaps especially for those a little bit younger than I am in this virtual room, this is going to be a huge issue through the rest of your professional lives. How do we translate our regression equations and the equivalent that we do in brain science or whatever it is into actually contributing to policies that help our grandchildren and their grandchildren? This is one of the reasons why I thought in this 50 minutes or so, I wouldn't dive into the technical details. This is partly me raising the question for all of us. How would we do that? Now, we know from the well-being equations that we can put a value, even a pound or dollar value, if we trust the marginal estimations, onto clean air and so on. And I remember, I think I saw the name of Finbar Brereton entering the whatever it is called, the room a moment ago. And I remember, I expect Finbar does as well, about 15 years ago, maybe more, I was fortunate enough to read his PhD thesis and visit Dublin. And I was very struck by some of those findings. I remember it's a good idea to live within 1 mile, was it Finbar? You don't have to answer immediately, 1 mile of the coast and so on. I remember looking at that dummy variable in that PhD.
We use the metric system, kilometers.
Oh, was it kilometers, was it, you mean? Anyway, you get the idea. And that's just, his work is just one of the examples of some of the important work that's been done. And many people listening will know about that, the literature that's come out of that. I wish I had contributed more on the exact details, but I'm afraid I really only chipped in on the methods, I suppose, earlier on. So how could we change people's behavior? And an important place to begin, in my opinion, and that's why I went through those slides and talked about the Virginia governor, that an important thing for people like us, going back to something Kate implied in passing, is to understand that you are not normal, ladies and gentlemen. I am not normal. I probably would like you very much if I meet you, if I haven't done so before, because you and I share very similar values and we think about economics and all sorts of stuff similarly. But of course, the problem for our society and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren is that when the voters are exposed to the costs of what will be necessary, then we're going to have a lot of what the Americans call pushback. Another source of the illustration, perhaps, of our problem can be found in large-scale data sets with a youngish economist called Adam Nowakowski. You can find this in an IZA discussion paper if you want. Adam and I looked at the 2016 European Social Survey, which asked 40,000 randomly selected Europeans how worried they were about climate change. And 1 person in 20 said, I'm extremely worried about climate change, 5% of Europeans. Now that's a few years ago. So we looked in the 2019 Eurobarometer surveys at a similar, not identical question where people are asked how they weigh up environmental concerns with other concerns. And climate in the environment in the 2019 Eurobarometer surveys, that comes 5th in a ranking of what Europeans care about, behind social security, unemployment, inflation, and in particular their own economic situation. It's vital, in my opinion, it's not very cheery, but it's vital for us and all the negotiators at COP26, despite the excitement, and all other pretty much highly educated liberal people, to appreciate there's a difference between the folk that you and I have around our dinner table in the evening as friends, and the average person, not a bad person, but just someone who is not like us. So how could we fix that? I'm going to stop in 3 or 4 minutes because I've presented the very, very difficult problem to us all. And I'd be interested in 10 minutes or so, whatever I'm allowed, of reactions. We could try to frighten people into being willing to put up with costs of giving up very fast fossil fuel BMWs and long distance flights and so on. In a way, that's partly what we did to get rid of smoking. And I like to go back to the smoking example. The history of smoking and how we got rid of it, at least very largely, is extremely interesting. And I'd advise anyone to read it if they're concerned about how we might mold policy to save our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So partly, of course, we made smoking very expensive, but we did something else, and I think that's vital on environmental and climate change issues. That is, we flooded people with publicity and public health messages. And I think that kind of approach probably has merit in this very difficult case. I'd like to see lots of public health messages broadcast on television and so on, which we could combine with advertisers. Advertisers know what they're doing, right? They know how to get people to buy things or believe in things. So somehow or other, we might adopt their methods or work with them. What else could we do? Well, there's a rather good IZA paper just come out written by Armin Falcon colleagues, which ran experiments where people were asked how much they would like to donate to a climate change cause compared to how much they want to keep. And the Falc information treatment, of course, there was a control group in that information treatment. The treatment group were exposed to different kinds of information messages. And in particular, they were told about how much other people think that we should combat climate change. That turned out to be highly effective because many, many citizens, our citizens, underestimate how much other people want to combat climate change. And that goes back to my point about who we talk to around our dinner table. See, we live in this heavily tribalized society, I'm afraid, where you and I, if you're anything like me, we don't spend a lot of time talking to people who think climate change is fine and they just want to drive a very fast fossil fuel car. So there's a lot of demarcation of beliefs and groups. Anyway, that's another approach. We could exploit the Armin Falcon colleagues' method of giving out information in a particular way. And then finally, then I'll stop. Of course, human beings are extremely interested in rank, in hierarchy. Indeed, I don't think they're very interested in money at all. I'm sorry if you think that's a shocking thing for Andrew Oswald to say. I don't think they're very interested in money at all once they've got a roof and food. What they're interested in is status and hierarchy. Now, of course, in the world we live in, material things tend to shape a great deal of that status. But if we could make being green a status good, if we could make being green a status good, ladies and gentlemen, in some way, then I think we could help save our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. These are all very difficult sub-problems within one giant problem. And I'm sorry that the sun keeps coming in and out of my room and occasionally I go dark. There's not much I can do about that. The sun caught me by surprise, but I am 1 mile from the coastline. Finbar will be pleased to know. I'm going to stop there if I may.
Fantastic. So I would direct anybody who's got a question for Andrew, would like to raise their hand or direct a question through the chat, please do so now. I might start with one of my own, if that's okay, Andrew. So you mentioned some tactics, and I think that they're very legitimate and worth exploring, but they seem rather extrinsic. So, you know, status driven, absolutely, thinking about other people's actions, using that as a norm to try to encourage people, and scaring people to a large extent of the risks involved in climate change. Are the reason that you bring those three up because you're looking to address a group that you have already outlined is not the people necessarily who are in this room? Do you think that there's a role for intrinsic motivation in doing the right thing that extends beyond people who are environmentalists or have, highly pro-social leanings anyway? I'm wondering whether you think that those intrinsic motivations can be broadened to appeal to more people.
Yes, and of course you reason very well. Yes, I do think that's got scope. But I am very influenced, like we all are, by my own statistical findings. You remember I said that admittedly it was 2016, maybe things have changed, but 5% of Europeans say I'm extremely worried about climate change. So that's partly my motivation. The ones with strong internal preferences to care, to be green and so on, in a way, they're not my primary worry, Kate. There's no point, I've reached a stage in my life where I've realized there's no point in thinking of people as being put into boxes of bad people and good people. And I've also come to realize that human beings are not perfectible. They are not perfectible, ladies and gentlemen. So somehow or other we have to muddle through, because almost everyone has a good side, and the intrinsic motivation can be appealed to. But I think we're going to struggle, I'm afraid. I've gone dark on my face again because the sun's beaming through. Sorry, I should have planned ahead and closed the curtains.
No, you were just delivering that message in the right shade. No, absolutely. I take the point. So I think I'll turn now to Chris Jobin, if I'm pronouncing that properly, who's next in line for a question.
Perfect. Yeah, I guess in terms of being eco-friendly as a status symbol, at least within sort of the younger generations especially, you already sort of see that happening, it feels like. That, to be fair, it's usually in sort of areas and ways that are also expensive, that like you get this thing which is eco-friendly that also happens to be sort of very fashionable. I guess, how are you talking about maybe extending that to other areas, other generations? I'm sort of the idea that it's not already happening is where I sort of am a little confused.
Well, you're quite right, Chris, about the young. And if you estimate climate change concern equations or that kind of thing, which I have done, then of course the young are much more concerned. So partly I'm back to what I just said before, that there's a group, you see, who are highly environmentalist, and they talk to each other a lot, quite naturally. It's the older, typically, I'm afraid, the older citizens and those with different kinds of political instincts that we need to work on at some level. If I'm allowed to ask you a question back, what's your instinct about how we could get, if there is major pushback after the enthusiasm of COP dies down, what's your own view on how we could get people on board who really want to fly to Barbados? I have a friend in Amsterdam, just while you think it over, and I said, I'm getting an electric car. Don't you think you should? This is a very wealthy couple. And they said, well, we'd like to, but we often have to drive 1,000 kilometers to go skiing from Amsterdam. And I thought, there you have it, you see. There you have it. This couple could afford 2 Teslas quite easily. You know, they're good people, but that's immediately what they said. What do you think we could do?
I mean, I think it's, you get into those logistics of, I guess on that one, like maybe doing something around the weight that you have to have for an electric car, because there's like that 3 or 4 hour wait that like is so different than just filling up your car. Like, instead of turning that into a burden, somehow turning that into a gain, especially in terms of whatever people's mindsets towards living in the moment, all that sort of thing. That it's like, oh, take some time during your break, and that because I don't know, some of the good ones, I don't think all of them are, but like instead of putting them at gas stations where they don't actually need to be, putting them next to parks and stuff where some of them already are. but the other one towards other groups that aren't young or aren't wealthy or aren't liberal, that reframing the things which are eco-friendly as other things, I don't know, for example, electric cars. If you frame an electric car in red country as good for the environment, that sort of coming from a traditionally red state and from a red family, that sort of turns people off to a certain extent. And that reframing it as cost effective, as using the other things and maybe not even directly talking about the eco-friendliness might be the best way to actually get them to be eco-friendly.
Thank you. I should take some more questions. I see these yellow hands.
I think Finbar's up next on my screen.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Andrew. I remember well my Viva from many years ago, and Andrew was a very nice extern, so he told me I passed before we got into the nitty gritty, which made me feel very at ease. It was a lovely way to do it. I guess I'm really interested in what you were talking about in terms of the importance of politics in solving the climate crisis. So getting voters on board is absolutely essential. I mean, as economists, we always start with the first best solution and then move back to what's acceptable. Political scientists actually do it the other way around. They start with what is acceptable. But I mean, one of the things that has, I think, worked quite well in an Irish context is the idea of citizens' assemblies. So we had one in terms of climate change. And rather than starting with an evidence-based, it's more evidence-informed policymaking. So evidence being one component of policymaking. So obviously people's ideas, in embedded cultures, etc., are really, really important. So it fleshes out what's acceptable to the voters before the politicians can put the policies in place. I think in terms of a research policy interface, it tends to work quite well. I don't know if there's any examples in the UK context of that working, but we also had, correct me if I'm wrong, Kate, the same-sex marriage. We had on the abortion referendum, something quite similar. Yeah. So it does seem to work quite well. And then the politicians are more, I guess, acceptable to implement the policies that have been agreed at these, because they include both the research, but also those other elements that are key to policy making.
I like citizens' assemblies very much, and I have a close friend who designs them. So that's, those could be exploited much more widely. I've got Charlie and Nikita on my screen as having their hand up.
Shall I jump in here? So my question is based around the use of positive emotion. And my background, so I'm a local politician in Oxford as well as MSc in behavioral science. And we used, actually, there's a lot of people really like the policies we've just put in, which makes driving much more difficult and enables modal shift to walking, cycling, public transport when framed as something that's positive for children, healthier, more livable streets, all that kind of stuff. It does get visceral pushback, but actually from a much smaller proportion of society than it seems. It's like most people, when asked, people think that most people dislike it because the noise is so loud, but actually most people themselves like it. So I guess my main point is that my question really is do you see much of this positive framing, positive emotion being appealed to in the narrative so far?
I'm sure we could exploit that more, Charlie, and you make a very good line of argument there. I've certainly argued that one role that economists could play is to paint an attractive picture of the future. Sometimes I appeal to a fact, a remarkable one, in case you don't know it, ladies and gentlemen, that in 1920, 1 century ago, there were 1.3 million coal miners, 1.3 million coal miners in this country. And the labor force was getting on for half of what it is now. And I don't think many people in 2021 would lament that change. Of course, at the time, it was extremely painful to give it up. But if we could help paint a picture of a much nicer world, that would help offer what one might call positive emotions. Economists could do that despite being the dismal science. Nikita and Garima I have, and I'm going to let Kate decide on the total timing.
We have until 22, so we've loads of time for questions. If you're happy to take them, Andrew, we'll keep firing them at you.
It's perfectly fine. I can't see the time immediately. Is Nikita there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So my question, I have two questions actually. The first one is about you mentioned how status quo, giving a status quo to consumer goods, which are eco-friendly, can help climate change, and especially with the findings in Europeans. So my question is with regards to the developing world and the emerging economies. While they contribute less to the climate change issues, but at the same time, given the increase of consumerism in these societies, how do we address the issue, especially because with context to India, savings is a big thing, and status quo and assigning status quo to consumer goods, which are very eco-friendly, is still something that privileged people can afford, not regular people can afford. So how do we change the behavior of the unprivileged people who are still using plastic because it's cheaper? Second question. Sorry.
Maybe that was quite a long question, wasn't it? You broke up slightly there, but I think you're asking, how do we change the behavior of what you call unprivileged people?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's one of the key issues. In a sense, that was the question, at least in part, that I appealed to, that researchers like you and I have to help solve. And I'm afraid it's going to have to be a mixture of appealing to their better natures, appealing to their long-run natures, perhaps reminding them about their grandchildren, what their grandchildren's lives will be like, but also, if possible, offering something positive. If you're especially concerned about inequality within your question, I mean, in principle, we could have policies that are much more painful, would be a strong word, for the rich. And of course, there's this very deep question about, should developing countries really have to pay for a fossil fuel generation that was done by other rich countries 100 years before them? I'm not sure if you're allowed a second question. What do you think, Kate?
I might jump in just very quickly with one from the chat. So Susanna Ferreira, who's joining on the panel tomorrow, is watching from the States, is watching today's proceedings with her environmental economics students. And one of her students, Caroline Solomon, was asking whether you think making being green into a status symbol would actually switch off those sorts of gatekeeper environmentalists already, or are they already sold on it? So
yes, that's a very clever idea. If we think about purchasing Tesla cars, then my judgment would be that has become a status symbol. And I'd be surprised if it's put off environmentalists. But my own view is, if necessary, we'll have to lose the hearts and minds of a few strong environmentalists along the way to get the rest moving in the right direction. So I think one would be too pessimistic to worry a lot about that. I hope the questioner doesn't feel that's unfair of me.
And great, I'll direct you back to the hands that are up. So there's both Garima and Ganga who have questions for you now.
Are we Garima?
I wanted to ask if climate awareness changes people's behavior towards climate change.
You're very quiet.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, more like that. That'd be great. Do go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask if climate change, if awareness about climate change brings any kind of difference in people's behavior towards climate change. Does awareness play any part in it? And if so, then will a compulsory course about this would help in bringing more people towards the, would make more people environmentalist, or would let them adopt that?
At least from where I'm sitting, that you did break up a bit. Kate, did you get that any better than I did?
So the question was whether, I guess there's a direct influence from being aware about climate change issues to actually taking action in pro-environmental directions.
Yes, okay. Well, insofar as we're on exactly the same wavelength, Garima, and I hope we are, one interesting thing that you see in the data sets I've been looking at, one is the Understanding Society micro data set in Britain, which has a lot of questions, is there's something of a disconnect between people saying they actually act to say turn off lights a lot in their home compared to those who are in a broad sense concerned about the environment. And in some of my work, not in the public domain yet, we found that, and I'm pass this on to anyone interested, in the Understanding Society data set, you get much stronger predictor effects from looking at those who say, I take these green behaviors, than you do from looking at the people who just say, I believe in green things, if I'm making sense here. So if anybody listening wants to work on the Understanding Society dataset, I would direct them especially to the behavioral questions on green, not on purported beliefs about being green. I don't know whether that answers the question, but unfortunately, I think there is a distinction between saying I worry about this and actually being willing to do anything.
Thank you.
So actually, my question is exactly on that, saying versus doing. A lot of the motivation was, especially in the beginning, the way you set it up, was actually there's a lot of people who disagree with, say, the COP26 agenda or going to net zero. Yes. And there's not enough public support for this. And to me, that seemed like a question of changing minds, which is often a way into changing people's beliefs or policy preferences. There's been this whole turn towards behavioral science where we should really be focusing on impact and impactful behaviors and not really about changing minds. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on what we really should be focusing on and prioritizing, because I feel like it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but ultimately we do have scarce resources. So should we be focusing on changing minds to get greater democratic mandate and buy-in, because it can backfire if we don't, or should we focus on changing behaviors, which can be very context specific?
Well, I admire your beautifully lucid question. I just wish I had a beautifully lucid answer. We don't know, do we? I'm afraid. And somehow or other, we're going to have to muddle along in the middle, doing a bit of both and doing other things. If you have been trained like I have as a regular economist with a bunch of economics degrees, you've been taught, and you probably taught your students, that preferences are given, immutable even. And that's not how, say, doctors viewed it at all on smoking. And it's not how most social science, behavioral science disciplines even think about human beings. So to cut a long story short, because I'm conscious of all the people, and we have an interesting session coming, I would encourage those with a regular economics background to think this is a problem where we need to alter people's preferences or help them to have different, better preferences.
No, I agree.
I just want to unfortunately close the session there. I could talk all day to Andrew and ask many more questions are streaming through the chat. We just won't have time for them based on the fact that we have a whole session and I've only one job to time keep today, and this is the only one. But Andrew, it was an absolute pleasure to hear from you, and really a valuable way to start this workshop. It's got us all thinking. I'm very grateful for you taking so many questions from us.